So for those who are new tonight, I saw a few hands over here to my right. The Friday Night Lecture series are a series of talks where we have an invited speaker, usually a scholar or an expert in their field, take on a big question in the evening. Think of it as an entire semester or a course that is summarized in one evening. No pressure, Cassandra, but that's what we hope you do tonight. Summarize everything you would teach in one course over a semester in 3 30-minute chunks. As I mentioned, we've had talks about the history of Christianity, archaeology, and other really big questions. So here's a really quick recap of the evening. We've divided up into 3 chunks. All right, it's a 30-minute lecture, 10 minutes for Q&A, and then 10-minute break to refresh your glass or get some more wonderful snacks that are over there to my right. For those who don't know, the restroom also is here to my right, down the hall, just beyond Steve's Cafe. Okay, our speaker tonight is Cassandra Nelson. Cassandra is currently the visiting fellow in literature at the Lumen Center. And if you read the little 10-year anniversary pamphlet, you'll get an idea of what that is. But it's one of our initiatives here at the Stephen Lowell Brown Foundation, where scholars gather and write and talk and think about big questions related to Christianity and culture. She is also an associate fellow at the University of Virginia's Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture. Her research centers on faith and technology in American literature and contemporary culture. Before coming to the Lumen Center, she taught composition and literature at Harvard University and the United States Military Academy, also known as West Point, right? Yeah. Cassandra received her BA in English and MA, and an MA in editorial studies from Boston University, followed by a Ph.D. in English from Harvard University. She has made significant contributions in literary studies, especially relating to Samuel Beckett and Flannery O'Connor. She has quite a few publications. I won't list them all off. We'll be here all night. But she has a brand new book that she just spoke about a few weeks ago called A Theology of Fiction, and that was published this year by Wise Blood Books. She has a forthcoming book entitled Selected Stories of Betty Wall, and that is published by the Catholic University of America Press, and is part of their Catholic Women Writers series. So, in tonight's talk, Cassandra will be discussing the relationship between fiction and technology with this wonderfully provocative title, Can Good Fiction Deliver What Technology Can't? Join me in welcoming Dr. Cassandra Nelson.
Good evening. Thank you for braving the snow globe that is the great outdoors right now. And thank you, Tony, for that kind introduction. This is quite an honor for me. This is a big production. I've never worn a headset like this before. And I'm immensely grateful to the Stephen and Laurel Brown Foundation for their support. Let me begin by offering one quick anecdote to show what that support has actually looked like on the ground in the last few months. If you'd asked me 3 months ago, can the Holy Spirit ever work through a marketing department? I would have said, oh goodness, no, that's impossible. Later this evening in the I'll explain a little bit more about why I think as a general rule that is in fact the case. The Holy Spirit and advertisements usually are at odds, either clashing or pulling us in opposite directions. But preparations for this evening have, for me personally, amounted to the exception that proves the rule. I gave the organizers of the Friday Night Lecture series only the barest of bones in sketching out what I might say this evening. I have a new book out called A Theology of Fiction. All right, here's the clicker. There it is. I would be remiss in at least not briefly mentioning that, and Tony, you did too. Thank you. It's available directly from the publisher, Wise Blood Books, which is actually a small press outside of Milwaukee if you want to support a local business. You can buy from them directly, and it's also available on Amazon if, like everybody, you want to save money and get free shipping. To the right, though, if you do order from Wise Blood, you can see their shipping team, which is Brittany Wren and 2-year-old Avila. Sometimes also a 7-year-old will go to the post office. I live in the same town, so it's my post office too. And they're very wonderful people. Anyway, given the timing of the lecture, it seemed like the most sensible thing to do would be to talk about fiction. But another research interest of mine has to do with technology, and specifically with the ways in which electronic technology is altering our understanding of reality, mortality, morality, and authority. And while people often smile at the mention of fiction, it is, after all, what New Yorker writer James Wood calls the fun stuff, their eyes really light up when the subject of technology is raised. We all love it, technology. And we all kind of know it's somehow killing us, technology. And we've all kind of agreed to ignore any cognitive dissonance arising from that contradictory state of affairs. So this evening, we're going to think more about what's behind that puzzling dynamic. But exactly how to connect those two subjects, fiction and technology, and how to articulate that connection in the form of one concise and compelling question was not at all clear to me in November. So I tossed out kind of the spoken word equivalent of hasty notes on a cocktail napkin. And then the next thing I knew, I saw this evening's lecture advertised in the Upper House newsletter, just like you all did. And the question was perfect. And so I thought, there's a good lesson for me. Never attempt to circumscribe the work of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit can work through a marketing department because they did in this one. So my main goal here tonight is really just to live up to the vision that Tony Bolos and what I'm told also Julie Bolos and Susan Smetzer Anderson had for this talk. They found the perfect hinge in terms of considering what fiction and technology each promise to do and how well they deliver or don't on those promises. So thank you guys for your good work there. Okay, we're actually going to stick with the idea of marketing a little bit longer in this first lecture. Before we begin, though, let's define our terms. When we hear the word technology today, you and I probably both picture smartphones. Like, good, that's perfect. That's exactly the kind of technology that I'm going to talk about tonight. Screen technology, which includes film, television, and computers. And now smartphones and smartwatches, and maybe even smaller smart things that I'm not aware of. Younger people, of whom there are not many right now, please send me an email if such things do exist, like to watch movies on smaller than a watch. The bottom line, though, is that by technology, I'm referring specifically to all forms of technology in which the basic unit is the pixel and the basic interface is the screen. But the word technology actually has a much broader application. It comes from the Greek word techne, which means art, skill, or craft. It can really refer to any product made by means of art, skill, or craft that is put to some practical purpose. That is, anything we might call a tool. Clothing, for example, is a technology to keep us warm and decent. Silverware is a technology to keep our hands clean while we eat. Maybe it's because we have so many tools at our disposal today, and we mostly buy them rather than make them ourselves, that we tend to overlook such humble examples of technology, like clothing and silverware. We take them for granted. One humble but actually quite impressive technology that is woefully underappreciated these days, in my opinion, is the Codex, which is just a fancy name for a book. There's a Gutenberg Bible from the Morgan Library in New York, but you could also picture a Penguin Classics paperback too. It doesn't have to be as fancy as all that. Before the invention of the Codex, human beings recorded their thoughts on scrolls, papyrus, cuneiform tablets, the stone walls of buildings, and other physical media. Codices, that's just the plural of codex, are actually pretty ingenious inventions. They can hold a lot more writing than a cuneiform tablet, they're not quite as heavy, or an inscription on a building. They make it easier to go back and find something that you've previously read than a scroll. They're durable. When I was in graduate school years ago, I made ample use of both books and a laptop. One of those technologies is still working just fine a decade and a half later. The other one has turned into a very expensive paperweight for my 5-year-old daughter to pretend she is typing on. It doesn't work. Maybe somebody can make it work, but not me. So when I refer to fiction tonight, good fiction, I'm first of all talking about a physical book with words printed on paper. And a quick aside, I promise I will not judge you if you use an e-reader. Some people travel a lot. It makes sense. But I'm going to take the printed codex as my starting point because there's actually a lot of research showing that we remember what we've read better when we encounter words printed on paper rather than backlit on a screen. So when I refer to fiction, I'm referring first, in material terms, to a codex. As for what is printed inside that codex, I'm not talking about just any novel or short story or poem. I'm talking specifically about literary fiction, as the German critic Wolfgang Iser defined it. Iser defines literature as writing that is characterized by indeterminacy. That is, writing in which there's some kind of gap, and therefore the reader has to supply the missing logic, or an overlap of sorts in which there are layers of meaning for the reader to discover and sift through and weigh. A gap in prose is kind of easy enough to picture in your mind. Words might be missing, as in Mad Libs, or redacted, as in a confidential document. But multivalency is a little bit harder to wrap your head around without an example. So I'm going to give two examples. When I taught first-year literature and composition, on the first or second day of class, I would draw an atom on the board to illustrate multivalency. And this was also a good chance for students who are much closer to their physics classes than I am at this point to, teach the teacher or whatever. And they'd have to remind me, like, how many electrons in the first shell and how many in the second. And so in my understanding of Iser's multivalency, each electron shell is a possible meaning in a story or poem, and that'll be less like abstract in a second. So in Julia Alvarez's poem, Poetry Makes Nothing Happen, for example, we briefly meet May Quinn. In a moment of depression, May eyes the bathroom cabinet that still held her husband's meds. In discussing the poem, students naturally generate a backstory for May's husband. Even without theoretical instruction in the literary criticism of Wolfgang Iser, students instinctively respond to the rich ambiguity of the phrase. They try to make sense of what's missing. They don't even know that they're doing it. They just do it. And most students, in my experience, when they hear of a sort of lonely person eyeing the cabinet, most of them assume that her husband died of an illness. Some assume that he's left her. Once, a student assumed that he was in jail. Between these various interpretations, meaning can jump as nimbly as electrons do, with the input of a different kind of energy from the reader. Here's another example of multivalency from a different poem that I used to like to introduce students to early on in the semester. It's called Filling Station, which is just like a slightly antiquated word for gas station, by Elizabeth Bishop. I'd ask students to read the poem once, and then have them stand up and go to the chalkboard or the whiteboard or whatever was in there and draw what's happening in the poem. I started doing this exercise in part because an awful lot of college freshmen today, and my teaching is like from 2018, so that I don't know it doesn't sound like it's improved with COVID and everything since then, but an awful lot of college freshmen that I came across seemed to think that a poem is just a word salad, just a blizzard of words out of which no order may be made, no story or meaning discerned. It's just a blur from which one is forced to extract keywords for use on standardized tests. In between the keywords, students seem to expect chaos or dead space. And I wanted them to see that good fiction really ought to tell a story. It ought to play out in your mind like a movie. And Filling Station was perfect for achieving that goal. In the poem, the speaker looks around a dirty gas station. She's never stopped there before. Her first impression is that the place is a real dump and she just wants to get going again. Then she realizes it's a family business. Initially, that discovery only increases her disgust and judgment. She can't believe that anybody would choose to live in such a greasy mess. But as she takes in a number of small details, like a dirty dog napping comfortably on the patio furniture, a potted begonia, comic books resting atop the handmade doily decorating a table, oil cans lined up neatly in a row, she starts to soften. She can't help seeing all the little signs that someone cares. The last stanza of the poem reads, "Someone embroidered the doily, or somebody embroidered the doily. Somebody waters the plant, or oils it maybe. Somebody arranges the rows of cans so that they softly say a so, to high-strung automobiles. Somebody loves us all." Students consistently produced wonderful drawings of this poem. Here are some examples now. These drawings beautifully illustrate the multivalency of Bishop's last line. Somebody loves us all. The poem doesn't tell us precisely who the somebody is, and so it can support all of the interpretations that you see here, and also some others that I don't have a picture of, but I heard students suggest aloud in the classroom. Somebody could be the mom at the gas station. It could be the reader's own mom. It could be Mary, the Blessed Mother. It could be God himself. Or you could just shrug your shoulders and draw a question mark and say it's a mystery. We'll never know. I don't know if it's on that one or a different picture, but someone did that, a stick figure and a question mark. So that's what I mean by multivalency and indeterminacy. There should be some richness to the language when I'm talking about the kind of fiction that I would encourage people to read. You have to be able to read for more than just plot, which is why the newspaper doesn't count as literature. And maybe some thrillers that you might buy at the airport, to read on the plane wouldn't count either. There has to be some room for the reader to exercise his or her judgment and play an interpretive role. Okay, so that's my definition of terms. Technology means screens, and fiction means a printed codex with a literary, that is to say, indeterminate text inside. Now back to marketing. One crucial moment in the history of marketing came in 1937. That's the year that Elmer Wheeler published a book called Tested Sentences That Sell: How to Use Word Magic to Sell More and Work Less. The scare quotes are his, and there's an exclamation point at the end of the title that I'm never sure how to adequately convey out loud. That's his too. Thank you for laughing. I forgot how scary listening faces are. I haven't been in a classroom, and you're just thinking, but you look like I'm torturing you. So that's where I'm like, okay, you're in it. You're in it still. All right, so there we are with Wheeler. And in the book, he offers a series of tips, which he modestly calls Wheeler points, for subtly influencing consumers. The very first one is a saying that you might have heard before. Don't sell the steak, sell the sizzle. By this, Wheeler meant that playing up the most exciting and emotional aspects of a product can do much to seal the deal and persuade customers to open up their pocketbooks. 14 years later, in 1951, Marshall McLuhan proposed a counter-strategy to Wheeler. In a book titled The Mechanical Bride, I see one person nodding. There's one McLuhanite. Okay, there's two of us in the room. The book is titled The Mechanical Bride, Folklore of Industrial Man. McLuhan argues that newspapers, comic books, and advertisements reveal much about the underlying beliefs of the society that produces them, just as ballads and fairy tales and myths did in ages past, hence the folklore part of the book's title. McLuhan encourages readers to simply become aware of, quote, the drama which is intended to operate on it unconsciously, end quote, and thus to resist falling under the spell of what Wheeler called word magic. So keeping that in mind, this competition, which is going on to this day between the Elmer Wheelers of the world, who want through advertisements to play on our emotions and take our money without our even noticing, and the Marshall McLuhans of the media studies world, who want to help us see that manipulation or influence more clearly and have a chance to decide whether or not we're actually okay with it. I'm using McLuhan's methodology to try to draw out some of the underlying beliefs that we as a society might have about technology today. And I've done so by looking at advertisements, movies, and at least one New Yorker cartoon, what we might call the folklore of contemporary America. I should warn that my examples here are comically outdated. They come from 2012 to 2014, which is when I was writing my dissertation on this subject, and which is just depictions of screens in American fiction. And I'm like kind of a Luddite. I don't get out much. I don't consume as much popular culture as I did, 10 years ago. So your completely optional homework in the next 15 minutes is to jot down any references to more recent films and TV commercials that illustrate the argument, because I'd like to publish that someday. And right now it reads like, it's a little bit like a fly trapped in amber, not from the Cretaceous period, but from the time when Carly Rae Jepsen's Call Me Maybe ruled the airwaves. So if you remember, I mean, it's a good song. I have nothing against top 40 music. But it's a little bit old. And what I wish to argue in the rest of this first lecture is that at least part of the sizzle that tech companies are currently selling is divinity. That is the state or quality of being divine. That is the state or quality of being like God, or potentially becoming gods ourselves, with, a lowercase g. And spoiler alert, in the second lecture, we're going to talk about why this promise is a hollow and very dangerous one. Some alert listeners might already have alarm bells going off. They might have noticed that that's pretty much the same promise that the serpent makes to Eve in Genesis chapter 3. But we'll stick with tech for now. So in particular, I've identified two kinds of narratives about technology that are sort of selling godhood as the sizzle and sort of gigabytes or whatever is the steak. The first narrative assigns to technology the power to give and take life, including immortal life. One commercial for Sony PlayStation in 2013, tellingly titled "Greatness Awaits." These things are all still on YouTube, so it's not too late. You can go watch it if you want. It addresses the viewer as, quote, "you who can rescind life or raise the dead." A year later, in the film Transcendence, Johnny Depp played a scientist whose consciousness is uploaded to the internet so that he can live on after receiving a fatal bullet wound. I didn't actually see that movie even then, but from what I could tell from the previews, the plan does not go well. But despite that, in the 10 years since that movie was made, people keep trying to figure out how to do the same thing in real life by mapping out an individual's connectome, which is the thing that connects all the neurons in your brain, to make a map of that and then try to put it on a computer and wonder if you're going to show up in the computer. I believe in immaterial souls, so I don't think they're ever going to crack that nut, but they're trying. Dmitry Itskov is one such person. He's a Russian billionaire who's using a portion of his fortune to pursue cybernetic immortality. The ultimate goal, he said in 2016, for her dated materials, is to transfer someone's personality into a new artificial carrier. Within the next 30 years, he predicted then, I'm going to make sure we can all live forever. More recently, tech entrepreneur Brian Johnson has made headlines for his Don't Die campaign, which attempts to use data and the scientific method to preserve not only our consciousness, but our physical bodies forever. I assume everyone knows, but most people, many people are no, I've never heard of this guy. He's infusing his young son's blood, but then that didn't take, so now they're on a different regime. It doesn't look good. You can look him up. But at this point, the thoughtful listener might pause and think, here are two men who have never seriously contemplated eternity. I've said it before and I'll say it again. I truly believe that some things will last forever, including the immortal souls of every person in this room. But institutional endowments, nope, not forever. The connectome machine, if they figure it out, not forever. You don't even have to be Christian to see the shortcomings to these attempts to cure death through technology. The ancient Greeks gave us the myth of Tithonus, a man who is granted immortal life by the gods, but not immortal youth. He ends up fading in strength and health until he is as tiny and shriveled as a cicada. In Alfred Tennyson's poem about this, he begs, he's kill me now, I didn't want this deal after all. Even if Dmitry Itskov or Brian Johnson crack the code, which they won't, but even if they did, they would eventually run into other difficulties. Let's say the Earth is rendered inhospitable by global warming, or we run out of water for human beings to drink because we're using it all to power Bitcoin mines. Let's say the Earth is swallowed up by the sun when the sun gets to its red dwarf phase. And maybe Elon Musk would jump into the conversation here and say, well, in that case, we'll just colonize another planet farther away from the sun to avoid being swallowed up. All right, even if they pulled that off, that would still only buy so much time. Eventually, the universe itself is going to end, whether it's in heat death or the big crunch or something else. I don't know. Ask a physicist. They know these things, or come up with ideas. But now I'm thinking way too hard about all of this, which is, I would suggest, precisely what the people selling us transcendence through technology don't want me or you to do. They'd rather we just take their word for it, keep scrolling, ask ChatGPT one more question, and turn off those pesky God-given intelligence machines. Anyway, back to the folklore of industrial man. One subplot of this narrative about technology's ability to give and take life, including immortal life, is the idea that there's going to be like an internet afterlife of some kind. Cloud computing, as you may have noticed, is marketed as a kind of data heaven, an immaterial celestial space where everything is always and forever safe. In reality, it's a bunch of server banks here on Earth. The servers are stacked on top of each other like pizza boxes, and they're susceptible to damage from thunderstorms and fire. And yet, the idea is a compelling one. In a cartoon for The New Yorker, Emily Flake shows a family walking away from a gravesite at a funeral. The mother's hand rests comfortingly on her son's shoulder as she says, "Pop-pop's in the cloud now, sweetheart." The second narrative, currently in wide, if subconscious circulation, attributes omniscience and omnipresence to computers. These two characteristics tend to be linked. I suppose it's because if you are everywhere and therefore can see everything, then you would know everything. In the film Her, for instance, an operating system named Samantha, voiced by Scarlett Johansson, quickly gains and then surpasses human intelligence. It's hinted that she's going to continue to evolve until she reaches a state of omniscience, and that her lack of a physical body will help her in this process. In a scene that, according to the screenplay, leaves the human beings around her feeling uncomfortable, awkward, and uncertain, she says, quote, "I actually used to be so worried about not having a body, but now I truly love it. I'm growing in a way that I couldn't if I had a physical form. I mean, I'm not limited. I can be anywhere and everywhere simultaneously. I'm not tethered to time and space in the way that I would be if I was stuck inside a body that's inevitably going to die." Well, we'll see. I hope I'm not running out of time, but a year later, Sprint would hold out the same promise of limitlessness in terms of both space and knowledge in a TV commercial. The voiceover begins on a quasi-religious note. Quote, "The miraculous is everywhere, in our homes, our minds," as a series of rapidly changing images are presented with increasingly quick cuts until it's no longer possible to see what's happening in any one image. That one is actually worth watching on YouTube. It's kind of eerie. There's blood cells pumping, the veins of leaves, planet Earth seen from outer space, a hand model holding an iPhone, a city at night flickering with lights, a computer-generated image of neurons pulsing with electrical charges, an actress playing a mother greeting an actor playing her son as he arrives home from school, a zoom in on the mother's eye until it dissolves in extreme close-up into pixels, child actors playing at first just one alone and then a group of them, accompanied in both instances by an iPhone, a newborn laughing, a star exploding, and on and on. Quite a lot of images can be packed into a 30-second commercial. Ultimately, the speaker is revealed to be a satisfied Sprint customer who assures viewers that, quote, "My iPhone can see every point of view, every panorama, the entire gallery of humanity. I need to upload all of me," the voice continues, apparently conflating himself with the data contained on his phone, and then concludes, I have the right to be unlimited. Only Sprint offers truly unlimited data for iPhone 5. What a come down. There's also a third narrative that takes the first two to their logical or illogical conclusion and posit that God himself relies on computers, or that God is a computer or is a computer programmer or something along those lines. There was a Super Bowl commercial in 2015 for Mophie, a company that I guess makes like chargers for phones, portable chargers. In that ad, they depicted the end of the world. Snow falls in Africa, a tree bursts into flames. And it's weird to me typing this up how many religious images. I don't know if that's deliberate on the part of the marketers or not, but like the tree bursting into flames obviously has, an echo in the burning bush that speaks to Moses. And riots consume cities around the globe, so there's chaos in the commercial. And then the view zooms out to space and then heaven, where God is looking at his iPhone in dismay. A tagline cements the joke. When your phone runs out of batteries, God only knows what can happen. Implicit in these narratives is the sense that whatever powers our electronic technologies have, we will have too, and we will be able to control. And if we think back to the second narrative about omniscience and omnipresence, on one level, it's true. Phenomenologically speaking, it feels like there is no question that I can ask the internet or AI and be denied an answer to. It feels like there's nothing I can't know. For instance, I learned about the heat death theory of the universe from reading short stories by Thomas Pynchon and Isaac Asimov. But I also got to toss in a casual reference to the competing Big Crunch theory, not because I know a lot about physics, but because I stumbled across it in the course of Googling the phrase, "How will the universe end?" Google was able to supply more information on that matter than the Book of Revelation in some ways. So phenomenologically speaking, you and I, we are able to transcend time and space in a way that previous generations could not have imagined. This is media theorist Anne Friedberg has shown in her book, The Virtual Window, how artists from the Renaissance on have used perspective to transform three-dimensional space to fit the planes of two-dimensional representation. In 1495, well, I don't want to skimp on the questions, but painter instructed other painters in 1435 to regard the rectangular frame of the painting as an open window. And perspective, as Alberti's image of a window and the word perspective itself suggest, assumes that first the painter and then the viewer are looking at whatever three-dimensional scene from a particular perspective, a particular vantage point, an embodied vantage point. But not anymore. Gone, says Friedberg, is the singular frame of perspective. Instead, computers have given us, quote, a multiplicity of windows within windows, frames within frames, screens within screens. In the new visual vernacular made possible by screens, space is both fractured and multiple, meaning that viewers can see several scenes, each quite remote from the others in space and time, simultaneously. What is more, the fact that we can pause, rewind, and fast-forward content on TV and streaming services have also made it seem like time itself is shiftable. And apps like TikTok and Snapchat, there's just a lot of different places and times jumbled together, and we get to jump around. In fact, Friedberg concludes, moving image technology in general has, from the invention of film onward, fostered the appearance of increasing freedom, not only from the bindings of material space, but also from the bindings of time. In real life, however, our own materialities and temporalities, as she puts it, have remained static. The result is a widening separation between the on-screen world and the off-screen world. Friedberg calls this gap between the on-screen world and the off-screen world an ontological cut. There's a stark difference between our existence online and our existence in real-time, real-world, physical and social spaces. Again, what a come down. If I can see everything and everyone online, if I can feel in total control, able to watch and judge others while remaining hidden behind an anonymous faceless veil in many circumstances, if I can present myself as perfect in avatar form, if I can die and be reborn 1,000 times in a video game, if AI gives me the answers to everything without my ever having to look someone in the eye and potentially face rejection or impatience or awkwardness or ignorance, why would I ever want to leave the on-screen world? And increasingly, it seems, we don't. What do I do now?
All right, we've got 8 minutes and 13 seconds for questions before the first break. So I've got to my right Dan Hummel and Susan Swanky to my left, and I'm down the middle. So raise your hand, we'll get you a mic.
Oh no, the computer scientist raised his hand.
You can go last if you want. You want him to go?
No.
Okay, all right.
So yeah, thank you for the very intriguing framing. You mentioned media theory, and some media theorists might argue that all we consume is media, It's just a medium that changes. So fiction, technology could be the fiction. And I wonder if you can reflect on that we could read a poem, we could watch a David Lynch movie. You still have to fill in a lot of things. You might look at classified ads somewhere. You might look at Facebook. And what do you think about this media being kind of what ubiquitously we consume, and a medium changes? Of course, in some forms, it's in more transient nature than others, but it's the same thing that we're consuming.
I think you're right that like we can't get away from media or like a physical medium. That's actually one thing that I don't think it's Friedberg, but it's N. Kathleen Hales has said that one thing about like screen technologies is it seems like it's just magically going through the ether. Like because of the bad weather, it's now magically going through the ether to be live streamed because, the roads are bad. But there's something somewhere, right? Like, I don't know, is it fiber optic cables? Is it, the actual way? And so, yeah, there always has to be matter involved. I think that that's right. One thing that an earlier iteration of the question had the word imagination in it. Is technology stealing our imagination? And so one distinction that I would make is between a medium like a printed codex that there will be exceptions to every rule, because as soon as I start to formulate it, I say it doesn't provide pictures, and then I'm like, but graphic novels do. But if you picture a novel by Charles Dickens or, I'm like an Americanist, like Don DeLillo, Thomas Pynchon, you're going to get a pile of words. You're going to get a pile of, characters on the page. And then from that, you have to bring the movie whirring to life in your mind. And I think that that's actually a really wonderful skill that I hope we don't lose collectively. And especially for like young minds, there's something about the work of that vision with the mind's eye that I feel we are in danger of losing when we're swamped by images that were generated by someone else. So imagination, and the word vision, if you look in the OED, for like the first 200 years or maybe longer, had to do with mental visions. Like Julianne of Norwich had visions and she saw, it had to do with the mind's eye before it had to do with the physical eye. So I would say, like, let's not forget the primacy of seeing with the mind's eye. And the other thing is duration. That there's something about reading a book or even watching a movie. You feel at the end as though you've done something, you've achieved something, you've learned something, versus like binge watching however many episodes of something on like Hulu or Netflix and you feel like kind of queasy afterwards, like you don't have that closure and that sense of a beginning and an end, and we just consumed like a whole integral thing here. But you're right, it's absolutely, there's a lot of overlap and mess.
All right. Next question.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm thinking about the idea that a lot of this technology is being advertised to us or pitched to us with a lot of the sort of "you will be like God" sort of messaging behind it. And I'm not going to be off the top of my head able to come up with advertising that's probably before this era, but I guess I wouldn't be surprised if the sort of aspiration to be like God has been a part of marketing for as long as there's been marketing. You could have a godlike body or, just all of these other sort of, that aspiration toward divine is always a good selling point. I wonder if not only the power of technology, but do you think there's something to the fact of these quasi, you will be like God sort of advertisements having a little bit more force in a time in which the non-existence of God feels more of a common assumption for
more people. So the idea that
No, I get it. And I'm used to being in a seminar, so I want to be like, what do you guys think? But I don't know if I'm allowed to do that. No, I think that's a really good point, because as you were speaking, part of me is thinking you're right. There's a long history of this, and good things can come from modeling your life after godlike characteristics, like not from technology, but like you're talking about exemplars, and it's not bad to, but I would say that, like, if we're going to follow Jesus, then it's not flashy. It's very humble, like it's a different look from what the video games are offering. Because I saw somebody go like, oh my gosh, no, what is she going to say? Like, no, I'm not going to back down. I'm going to say, like, the video game thing is bad. But yeah, that's where I think you do get into like the lowercase g gods. And that seems like a dangerous thing to play with. There's a line in a novel I like that I don't even want to say it out loud because I don't want anyone to make Cliff's notes for it. I have had success teaching undergrads, and I never want it to be on Schmoop or anything like that. But it's when the old god goes, they pray to flies and bottle tops. And so I do think that the kind of death of God, or the lack of like currency that traditional faith is, the ground that's being lost. I do think that it leaves room for a whole lot of dangerous ideas that try to, like, nature abhors a vacuum. I think culture abhors a vacuum too. I think if we're not presenting a sound model of faith and God and omniscience as a thing that like doesn't belong to me, thankfully, like it belongs to God. Like, I think if we don't have that as the model, then we're playing with fire to introduce, weird little versions of it, of like, talk to Chat GPT. Like, someone did like a Chat GPT confessional or something. It was like an AI thing, could hear I think it was more of an experiment. Like, I'm not really sure, but it was actually in a church. And I thought, maybe we shouldn't do that. I think it matters to be an embodied human being with like one finite perspective. And I think if we try to tell people you can be more than that, especially if they don't have a sound framework to test those ideas against, that's really dangerous. But I don't know. I'll let it.
Okay, we'll take one last question right here, and then we'll take a quick break.
I like that you called it snacks and not hors d'oeuvre.
You can tell it.
Yeah, there too.
Right. You should try the snacks. They're great.
Yeah.
So I am glad to meet you, Cassandra. Thanks for what you've given us so far. I'm thinking a little bit about modern fiction, like contemporary fiction, and in particular speculative fiction, which, as you probably are aware, has just exploded in the last few years especially. So that would include like science fiction, fantasy, and some of it is in fact literary. It's easy to kind of make fun of.
Yeah. No.
But I think that there's a lot right now. And if I was going to go back into academia, I'd probably be looking at that kind of thing. But I'm wondering, what strikes me about the title of this talk is that there's a lot of fiction about technology. And I wonder, it might be a direction you're going, but if you could maybe comment on, or maybe think of ways that you could extend your argument so far into what's happening currently. Or, I mean, you can really take speculative fiction from, the 50s or 60s as well. But I think it's a really ripe area where people are thinking a lot about this. And they're especially doing a lot of experimenting and throwing out crazy ideas to see what would happen if. And I think that they have things to say about your question about faith and fiction and technology.
Yeah, I think that I'm not an expert on science fiction. I know one person in this room who is a secret expert, but I won't put him on the spot. But yes, like genre fiction does not necessarily mean not literature. Like there is some high quality literary sci-fi out there. The two stories that came to mind when you were speaking, E.M. Forster's The Machine Stops. It's like 1904 or 1910. And it's the creepiest thing in the world because it's clearly like the internet or an iPad, and it's dangerous and terrifying. And then Isaac Asimov's The Last Question, And so, yeah, I think especially I'm not an expert, but like the little that I've seen of the post-war kind of like sci-fi golden age, like they were spot on, and it is kind of crazy. We will talk a little bit more in the next one about the prophetic role that literature can sometimes play, although not necessarily about specific like speculative things. And then there's, but yeah, and like that opens up a whole new wing that I know nothing about, but like fan fiction or what, like our understanding of like whether we receive knowledge from the author or we get to be part of it, generating it as it goes, like that seems very much in flux right now and in ways that could be relevant to all this. So thank you.